Hey guys, today we're going to go over some basics for piloting a Liberator better to hopefully stay alive longer and give your gunner better shots. I'll get into airframes and utility slots in a later video, but at the moment, in interests of time, this will just going to be general rules to follow no matter what loadout you're using. To start out, we're going to go over a couple of general rules that I like to try to follow to stay alive longer as the pilot. Rule 1 is never take any damage you don't have to take. What I mean by this is, even though the Liberator has a fairly large health pool, there's no real reason to tank damage if you're not gaining anything from it. Now, if you're killing a tank, taking out a large group of infantry, supporting your ground forces, it's perfectly understandable to eat a couple of lock-ons or a little bit of flak to finish taking your target down. But if you're around a fairly empty base and a heavy assault locks you, or a burster starts shooting you, just fly away. If you waste 15-20% of your health killing that one target, and then get attacked by an ESF, you're putting yourself in a much weakened condition for that fight. Essentially try to balance risk and reward. If there's a high risk of taking damage, and the reward is just a guy or two on foot, then go find another fight. You can cross the map in a minute or two in a Liberator, so there's no reason to take damage for 1 or 200 XP and put yourself in a vulnerable position to lose your lib. Rule number 2 is don't overstay your welcome. I see a lot of Liberators get shot down because they find a nice fight with minimal AA and they start wrecking shit. Then, a burster gets pulled and scares them away. 30 seconds later, they come back, but now there's 3 bursters and a squad of heavy assaults with lock-on, so the Liberator gets melted before they can get away. Typically, people don't just put away their AA the minute you leave an area, especially if you've been killing them with it for the last couple of minutes. That AA is going to tend to be present in force for at least 5 to 10 minutes, even if no other air shows up. So work on learning to read a fight and get out ahead. As the saying goes, pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. Don't be a hog. Rule number 3 is your priorities as a pilot. The first one is to keep your Liberator flying, and the second one is to kill the enemy. So don't overcommit to a kill. I've done this, and everyone I know has done this. You find a Skyguard in an open field and you just have to kill it. There's an irrational nagging in the back of your head informing you to cleanse the Raxus of those heathens that worship the god of flak. Ignore that nagging and ignore the Skyguard too. Unless you're supporting a squad or platoon, there's no reason to get tied down to one area. In a way, this ties back into looking at the risk versus reward of an action. If there's a very dangerous target that stands a strong chance of bringing you down with them, or weakening you to the point where the next ESF to sneeze in your direction kills you, then there's no reason to engage that target. You can easily find a much less dangerous target elsewhere, and that's what you should do. So don't let yourself get over-attached to killing someone, and always be ready to reevaluate the situation and leave if you're worried that your Liberator is going to take down. Sometimes this does mean you're going to have to let people go that are on fire or that are seconds away from dying, but if finishing them off means losing your Liberator, it's usually not going to be worth it. Rule number 4, and the last one, is map awareness. Try to be aware of the general state of the continent you're fighting on, and make a note of where large fights are so that you don't retreat right over an entire enemy platoon. I typically check my map every 5 minutes or so, and try to stay updated on where fights are, where enemy positions are, and where I expect them to be moving. This is going to help me when I'm in a fight. I'll know where I can retreat to, where I can't retreat to, and worst case scenario, I'll have an idea of where to bring enemies so that they'll hopefully get taken down by friendly forces. Now, with those rules out of the way, let's get into some basic strategies. When I'm flying, I like to stick to a general altitude depending on what I'm going to be engaging. If I'm going mostly for air targets, or I'm worried about tanks, I like to stay up around the flight ceiling. It makes it much harder for an ESF or Liberator to get the jump on me, and it keeps you at the extreme end of effective range of AA, meaning you're less likely to accidentally stray into an AA trap and get instantly melted. If your plan is to engage ground targets, or you're just trying to stay under the radar, then flying at ground level is usually a good, if somewhat risky, option. If you are going to fly that low though, don't fly 100 meters above the ground low. Fly 20 to 30 meters above the ground. At this level, you'll be able to use trees and almost anything else as cover, and you're also protected by the fact that people rarely look horizontally for a Liberator. However, a bad place to fly is right in between the ground and flight ceiling. When you're flying here, you have none of the advantages of flying high, none of the advantages of flying low, while getting the disadvantages of both of them. In general, for newer pilots, I would advise sticking to a higher flight path, since it's less tricky and comes with much less risk of accidentally splattering yourself across a mountain. Now, let's say you're in a fight and you start getting shot. What should your reaction be? The first thing you need to do is determine what is hitting you and from what direction. If it's a tank shooting at you, then your best option is almost always to ascend nearly straight up and try to break the angle that they can aim up at you. The only time this isn't the case is if you know exactly where the rounds are coming from, and you can break line of sight with something like a mountain quicker than you can ascend beyond the angle of their gun. This is going to be something of a judgment call, and if you're unsure, I would simply opt for the ascending towards flight ceiling option. If you're getting hit by flak, the best option is to typically get low to the ground. Flak has a relatively low angle that they can aim down, which means if you get close to the ground, they're going to have a hard time hitting you. However, they can aim essentially straight up, which means that no amount of ascending is going to stop them from hitting you. Dropping low to the ground and dodging through trees and covers, though, will help block shots, and it will make you a much more difficult target to hit. With a Liberator against flak, it's usually not a good idea to worry so much about performing rolls and maneuvers like you would in an ESF, and you should worry more about flying away in the quickest possible manner. The reason is that even a rolling and dodging Liberator is fairly easy to hit with flak, and doing maneuvers will only slow down your forward progress, leaving you in danger for a longer length of time. Now, lock-ons are a bit of a mixture of the two. The important thing with lock-ons is to remember that they can only lock out to 450 meters, which means that if you're flying 400 meters above the ground and you start getting locked, it's a fairly simple matter to ascend 50 meters and be out of their range. Breaking line of sight can be effective as well, so just choose the easiest route to either break their line of sight or get beyond the 450 meter mark. ESFs are going to be a little bit trickier than getting hit by ground forces. You can't really outrun them, and you can't break line of sight for more than a few seconds. So how do you put yourself in a more favorable situation? If you're around flight ceiling, there's really not that much you can do other than just turn around and fight or try to run away. But closer to the ground, you start having more options. The canyons of Indar and much of Amerish are especially helpful due to the large amount of terrain you can hide behind. The general strategy is to break line of sight and then try to position yourself in a manner where you have the upper hand when the ESF appears. One of my favorite strategies is to duck behind a mountain or a large building, and to then essentially land on the side of it facing towards where I expect my opponent to appear. They come barreling over the mountain at full speed chasing me, and instead of still being out in front, I'm underneath or behind them, giving me the advantage both of positioning and surprise. Since it takes a decent amount of time for any ESF to kill a Liberator, looking for more favorable conditions to fight is almost always worth your time while flying, and is usually worth risking a little bit of your health in order to get. If you have a good gunner, you can also try to lure the ESF into fighting in close range by bringing them into canyons where they have limited room to maneuver, which will make them a much easier target for your gunner. And now that we're talking about your gunner, let's talk about how to give them the shots they need. The most efficient way is if they're communicating with you and they're telling you what you need. But let's say the comms are down or your gunner doesn't have a mic. At this point, what you want to be doing is flying in third person, which I would recommend for most flying anyway. In third person, you can see where your belly gun is pointing. Pay attention to the angle that it's at and try to keep it so that it's almost always pointing straight away from the Liberator. From center, your gunner has the largest possible range of movement, and is less likely to get their shot thrown off when you make a sudden movement and the gun hits the limits of the angle it can aim. Try to keep sudden movements to a minimum as well. While crazy dodging might help you avoid a small amount of damage, it also makes it incredibly difficult for your gunner to aim accurately. If you give a good gunner a couple of shots from the same angle, you give them the best chance of getting the drop figured out and landing a shot. I typically try to alternate dodging with fairly even flight. I've also started to minimize the amount of time that I push Tank Buster on good pilots since it's fairly easy for them to avoid it. It is, however, useful as a way to make a pilot use up their afterburner fuel so that when your belly gunner starts shooting, they have much less maneuverability to try to dodge the shots with. As a pilot in a fight with an ESF, you need to try and keep that ESF relatively close. Many ESF pilots will try to simply retreat back to render range and pick at you with the nose gun, or run lock-ons and fire then pull off. The way to counter this is to constantly be pushing them with your Liberator. ESFs aren't too much faster than the Liberator, so if you're constantly attacking the ESF pilot, you don't give them much time to get damage off before you're close enough to engage. This forces them to either engage you in a more close-range fight or simply run away. Either situation is preferable to lobbing Daltons at an ESF that's 400 meters away. Just make sure to remember your map awareness while pushing an ESF. Many pilots will try to lure you into enemy territory or into a flak trap. Knowing where these are likely to be is the best way to figure out whether it's safe to pursue a target or whether you should break off. Now, obviously a lot of these abilities are going to come with time, and it takes practice to know when to attack and when to fall back. But if you start looking at fights a little more tactically and force yourself to remain aware of the map, it should help you stay alive longer and put yourself in more favorable situations. Oh, and never hover completely still in the Liberator. You are a joke to hit, and if your gunner can't hit shots while you're moving, you need to get a new gunner anyway.
This guy's just gonna chill at render.
Airborne target identified.
It's a trap! Oh, you little mutt. Very nice. Well done.